Hi, and welcome to Long Live the Queen, where we talk about the women who made history. And by we, I mean the royal we, because it's just me. Today, it's Testosterone Tuesday.
Which is just as good as Taco Tuesday, but better.
Sometimes.
Spicy.
Usually, it's just me, but today I have my friend Karen with me. Hi, Karen.
Hello.
Are you ready for Testosterone Tuesday?
Absolutely.
For today's Testosterone Tuesday, I'm going to talk about King Richard III.
The third.
I covered England's last King Henry last time, so I'm covering England's last King Richard this time.
The last.
King Henry VIII was the last Henry that England had.
Not the eighth.
And King Richard III is the last Richard. And usually the last of their name are fairly infamous. That's why there's not another one.
Ocho.
King Richard III was born in the year of our Lord, 1452. But he wasn't King Richard yet. He wasn't even expected to be king because he had 3 older brothers. And they weren't even supposed to be king, but things shifted.
Openings appeared. Opportunities presented themselves. Nature hates a void. Here I come.
Richard was born to 37-year-old Cecily Neville, Duchess of York, and her 41-year-old husband, Richard, Duke of York. Richard's 2 oldest brothers, Baby Richard's 2 oldest brothers, spent a lot of time with their father, and they were older, so they were preparing to be future noblemen. Richard spent his youth with his brother George, 3 years older than him, his mother, and his sisters. His oldest sister, Anne, had been married, but Elizabeth and Margaret, 8 and 6 years older than Richard respectively, were still at home. When Richard was about 2.5, his mother had her last baby, a little girl named Ursula, who did not live long after birth. She was born and she died not long after. This cemented Richard's spot as the baby of the family. 40-year-old Cecily would have no more children. Richard was close with his mother. They had lost many children, specifically 4 boys that had died young. And her older boys were often off with her husband, so she held her 2 youngest sons close. So she was close with her 2 youngest sons because she had a lot of sons die before this.
Unfortunate.
And it was said that George was her favorite, but Richard was right there. He was a close second, I think. When Richard was about 6 years old, his 14-year-old sister Elizabeth was getting married to 16-year-old John Delepole, the young Duke of Suffolk. There had been some drama in England. The king was mentally unwell, off and on. Richard's father, as his cousin, was the regent of the country. So when the king was unwell, he would kind of go into a catatonic state. He was awake, but he had to be treated like a baby. He had to be taken care of like a baby.
Unavailable.
Yes. So baby Richard's father was the one who was like standing king when the king was unwell. The year after Richard's sister Elizabeth married the Duke, Civil War broke out. And Elizabeth's husband, Richard's sister Elizabeth, her husband was a loyalist to the crown, and the rest of Richard's family were not. So, because his father was leading the rebels. So they wouldn't have seen his sister for a while. They were on opposite sides of the Civil War. Just 2 years into this Civil War, Richard's father and one of his older brothers were killed. So he's still little. And this meant his older brother, 18-year-old Edward, was the new leader of their faction, along with his mentor and cousin, the Earl of Warwick. They fled to exile to regroup. They were like, shoot, let's pull it together. We got to do this.
Time to boogie.
Cecily was worried about the fate of her 2 youngest sons. They would be seen as Yorkist threats and too young to participate in the war. 11-year-old George and 8-year-old Richard were sent to grow up in the court of Philip III, Duke of Burgundy. They sent them to France, and they were like, look, it's not safe here. You're too little to fight. You have to go live in France for a while. Philip the Good was on the York side, and a pretty powerful vassal over in France. George and Richard spent at least 6 months in Burgundy, while their mother supported her oldest son in his quest to overthrow the Lancastrians. So for 6 months, they didn't live with their mother. They just lived over in France while their brothers and their brother fought the war, and their mother tried to assist.
Now, what type of communication would they have had during that period?
Letters potentially, but also it was during war, so the letters weren't
How would
reliable.
they be delivered? possibly
by hand.
pigeon? No,
By hand.
By hand. No pigeon
So,
available.
No, not one that can go across the ocean.
Nope. And they were SOL. No cell phone.
Nope.
No towers. No Wi-Fi.
The following year, though, Richard's brother defeated the Lancastrians at the Battle of Towton, and George and Richard could return home to England. Their older brother was now the teenage King of England.
Nice.
He had overthrown the mentally ill King Henry VI. There was some adjustment drama. Their older brother had picked the wrong wife, in everyone's opinion. The new young king loved his beautiful wife, but everyone around Richard would have been talking about how inappropriate of a choice she was.
Unfortunate.
But the king wouldn't be deterred. The queen was the queen. He was married to her, he loved her, and she was the queen. And the scandalous queen was Elizabeth Woodville, and she has an episode if anyone wants to go check out that drama. Now it was time to worry about George and Richard's education, which had kind of fallen short. This was during the time they were supposed to be learning how to be knights, squires, whatnot, but everyone was at war and busy. And their brother was the only one who could teach them, and he was the King of England now and a teenager, so he needed to outsource this job. So he sent his little brothers to his cousin/mentor's estate, Richard, Earl of Warwick. This is where Richard and George went for knight training. They had been too young to learn it during the war, but now there was some peace, so there was time. The Earl of Warwick had 2 daughters, Isabel and Anne, who were 1 year older and 4 years younger than Richard, respectively. So one daughter who was a year older than him, one daughter who was 4 years younger.
So available?
Yeah, it was suspected that even before their father's deaths, that it was a double marriage alliance was in the works by their fathers. Isabel was supposed to marry George, and Anne was supposed to marry Richard. George and Richard stayed with Warwick a few years, while their older brother, the king, paid like a kind of tuition for them. Warwick was reimbursed for his tutelage. Their mother was working on a marriage alliance with their teenage sister Margaret, and it was to the same Burgundians that Richard and George had lived with during the war. So now it was like, thanks for taking care of my brothers during the war. Here's my sister. You can marry her. George and Richard would have somewhat grown up with Isabel and Anne, but their educations would have been kept separate. 2 of them were learning how to sword fight and horseback ride, and 2 of them were learning how to embroider and dance.
I'd go with the sword fight and horse any day.
If you were a girl back then, you wouldn't have a choice. You'd get the dancing and the embroidery.
That's where midnight riding comes in.
Once their education was done, they moved to their brother's court. Now it was time to learn how to be competent, loyal supporters of the king, their brother. At court, they would see their sister-in-law, the scandalous Queen of England. And word on the street, and by streets I mean the little castle corridors, was that Queen Elizabeth may be a witch.
Not a witch.
She had gotten the king to fall in love with her very quickly. So people thought, like, maybe that was magic.
Maybe.
And she only had girls, Elizabeth, Mary, and Cecily. So that wasn't a good look. And she was maybe descended from a mermaid. So the magic thing made sense.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that whole story's in Jacquetta of Luxembourg, her mother's episode. They may be descended from a mermaid.
Mermaids.
Richard seemed to, for the most part, get along with his older brother and his wife. Their older brother, George, didn't. He resented them. The king and queen decided that maybe it wasn't a good idea to marry the king's brothers to Isabel and Anne, the 2 richest heiresses in England. The same girls they had grown up with, and it had been assumed they would marry when their fathers were fighting together in the Civil War. So everything changed. They were like, I don't know that we want to give them that much power.
Yeah, maybe we want to explore our options.
Because of this, Isabel and Anne's father was also getting irritated. Why shouldn't his daughters marry the king's brothers unless the king didn't trust him? He took it as a slap in the face.
Oh.
And what do you do when the king doesn't trust you? Well, if you're Warwick, you run away and raise an army and marry your daughter Isabel to the king's brother George anyway, confirming everyone's suspicions about Warwick's ambition. Richard stayed loyal to his brother, the king, But this would have been difficult, fighting alongside his brother against his cousin and his older brother. So this was just more of a internal family war. Warwick and George did not fare very well and ended up fleeing with their families to Calais, who in turn remained loyal to King Edward and raised their harbor chains, which meant that harbors had chains across the opening, so when they didn't want to let boats in, they would raise the chains, and the boats, if they tried to come in, would get broken against the chains.
Clotheslined.
Yep. So that same day, Isabel went into labor on that boat and miscarried her baby because the harbor chains were raised. Back in England, Richard and his brother discussed accepting George back, but only if he was really, really sorry.
So sorry. So sorry.
They managed to get a letter to one of Isabel's ladies-in-waiting, saying as much, and George responded, yeah, okay, I'll get there when I have time. So he was sorry-ish.
Sorry you're so stupid.
Yeah. Sucks to suck. When George got around gathering up his teenage wife and returning home, his father-in-law/cousin was pretty angry at the betrayal. He's like, you just took my daughter and, betrayed me. Although they had lost, so what was George going to do?
What are you going to do?
He responded by marrying his second daughter, Anne, to the son of the old king that he had just helped to depose, the mentally ill one. So he was switching sides. He was so mad he was going to overthrow the king. He had fought a civil war to crown in the first place. He was like, okay, change your mind. You're a bad king. Don't like you. Warwick liked making kings, and that's why they called him the Kingmaker. That's how he's known. His moniker is the Kingmaker. But that was the Neville sister that was supposed to marry Richard. So now who's Richard going to marry? They invaded England and attempted to overthrow the government for a second time. They didn't. They lost. Warwick was killed, and so was his son-in-law, the Lancastrian Prince Edward. The old queen, Margaret of Anjou, and her new daughter-in-law, Anne Neville, were captured. The old king and queen were put in the tower until it was decided what to do with them. At some point, the old king died from melancholy.
Sadness.
But word on the street is he may have been smothered on the orders of one of the York brothers, either the king or one of his brothers, George or Richard. Anne Neville was put into custody of her brother-in-law, the king's brother, George. We don't know how she felt about that, but what we do know is that at some point, Anne ran away with Richard to get married.
Eloped.
Yep, they fully eloped. Maybe they were in love. Maybe she was rich and trapped under the thumb of her brother-in-law, and she's like, look, I could just marry his brother and be sort of free. George took this wedding as a full slap to the face. As Anne's guardian and Isabel's husband, he was set to get all of Warwick's fortune. Now he felt that his younger brother Richard had stolen half of Warwick's fortune by secretly marrying Anne.
Ooh.
But Richard and Anne thought that it was better to ask for forgiveness than to ask for permission, and they went to the king and apologized and said they were in love. And the king forgave his youngest brother, who had always been loyal to him, and told George to get over it. By now, the king and
The heart
queen...
wants what the heart wants.
Yeah.
A fortune.
By now, the king and queen had sons, so it looked like George and Richard wouldn't be needed to be spares. George got angry again. He had Anne stolen from him, and he was telling people that the queen was a witch. When his wife died after having her third child, he accused the queen of killing his wife with witchcraft, along with a couple of servants that he had executed. This didn't go over well at court. You can't just call the queen a murdering witch, even if you are the king's brother. Richard's brother was arrested, tried, and executed, reportedly being drowned in a barrel of his favorite wine, Malmsey wine.
Got a little bit tipsy.
Yep, the 3 York brothers were down to just 2 York brothers, just Richard and his brother, King Edward. And Richard stayed loyal to Edward until his death. So loyal that on Edward's deathbed, he changed his will to specify that he wanted his brother Richard to be regent for his son until he was old enough to reign for himself. His wife Elizabeth was not in favor of this. The Crown Prince Edward had been living with her brother, but the king said Richard would know what to do. Richard will know how to make him a king. After the king died, Richard went to obtain the new little king from his other uncle. He refused to hand the king over to Richard, and there was a skirmish. Richard obtained custody of his nephew and brought him to the Tower of London for his safety.
I'm hearing against his will.
Yeah, pretty much. The young king's mother panicked and took her other children with her into sanctuary, claiming they had to run from the murderous Prince Regent Richard. All coming from the potential murdering witch, Queen Elizabeth. So nobody really knew who to listen to. Richard was furious at his sister-in-law for not trusting him. He started to negotiate to allow his other nephew to join his brother in the tower for safety and for company, and to prove that Richard could be trusted, and Elizabeth could keep her girls with her in sanctuary. So we don't know exactly what happened next. The official records say that Elizabeth handed over a 10-year-old male child to Richard to join his brother in the tower. But there is a persistent story that Elizabeth snuck her son away, replacing him with a peasant boy in nice clothing. And the peasant boy was actually the one sent to the tower. And she sent her son away to be safe somewhere else. And if Richard could be trusted, she could always bring him back and be like, JK, I sent you a different kid. No worries, though. Now I trust you. But the boys in the tower were just seen less and less until they were just never seen again.
Vaporized.
They're gone. And Prince Regent Richard became the new King Richard III. And that's what we call motive. So...
Motive.
It might not be true. There are hardcore Richard stans who are like, no, he's absolutely innocent. He was framed. It was a frame job. But it doesn't look good. Like, it was a good frame job if it was a frame job.
Could be.
Did Richard have his nephews disappeared? Maybe. Maybe not. We don't know what happened to them. There are also rumors that Richard had them sent into hiding. Like, maybe he was like, look, they're not safe here. But also, he was the one who was supposed to keep them safe. So sending them off into hiding and disappearing them, I don't know.
Depends on who had him.
Somehow, King Richard convinced his sister-in-law to send her 2 oldest daughters to court, where he was. And if she did, she would be allowed with her younger daughters out of sanctuary. It's like if you send your 2 oldest daughters to court, the rest of you can go live at your house.
Payment in full.
Manor. Princess Elizabeth and Princess Cecily went to live at their Uncle Richard's court in the same palace that they had grown up in as children when their father was king. But now their uncle's king.
We know how the uncle story usually goes.
This is around the same time that the rumors started. King Richard seemed to prefer his niece Elizabeth to everyone else.
Uh-oh.
Sometimes it seemed like he was placing his niece on equal rank to his wife, Queen Anne. One time he bought them matching gowns and they wore them to dinner at the palace. So people were like, that's strange. It's a weird look, bro. King Richard and Anne lost their only son to childhood illness. They no longer had an heir, and the people were losing confidence in this king. They were like, look, God probably doesn't like him because his only kid just died. And Richard then heard about an invading army. Henry Tudor was invading with his French army. Richard was a weak king with no wife and no son, but he took his army to fight King Henry Tudor at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. Now, if you know one thing about the Battle of Bosworth Field, then you probably know everything, because the Battle of Bosworth Field is famous for being the battle when King Henry VII killed King Richard III, taking over the throne of England for the Tudors from the Yorks. But Henry Tudor's grasp on the throne wouldn't be very strong. He had just come in with an army and killed the old king. So that's a tenuous hold at best. So he married Richard's niece, Princess Elizabeth, the one who Richard may have also been involved with. And they became parents of King Henry VIII and are the ancestors of today's modern royal family.
There you go.
And that is where we'll leave it for now. What did you think of King Richard III?
He had a lot of decisions to make.
Yeah, it was rough. I don't know. And the crazy thing is, he was loyal to his brother the whole time. And then after his brother died, his brother's sons just went missing. Which is why the people who are on Richard's side are like, no, he's innocent. Because he was loyal to, he wouldn't have disappeared his brother's kids. He was loyal to that brother. But it did mean that he could be king, so.
It's a trade-off. That's how life works.
Yeah.
Oh.
It's rough. And we
might
never
be rich
know.
in money, but they were poor in other things.
Yeah. And even if we were to find out what happened to them, say they got murdered, we probably won't ever know who is responsible for their murder. Because a lot of people had motive.
That's where that take the secret to the grave comes in.
A lot of people had motive. The thing that gets
Somebody does know.
Is that King Richard had the power. He had motive and control of the children when they went missing.
So yeah, kind of interchangeable people sometimes, but...
Yeah, what do you think? Are you Richard was framed, or are you Richard's probably guilty?
No, guilty.
Yeah, I do lean on the guilty side. Every once in a while I'm like, maybe not, but most of the time I do lean guilty.
I believe guilty because, I mean, to a degree they're forced into certain decisions.
Exactly.
I mean, worse or better. They just limited choices.
He was never supposed to be king. He was the youngest son of his family.
And at first you might not want something, but give it a while, you'll start wanting it. Mm-hmm. So yeah, tragic. Very tragic.
Power corrupts.
Power corrupts, absolute.
And thanks for recording with me. That was fun.
That was super fun.
Will be remembered.
Thanks for listening.